ARE Podcast, episode number 64.
Welcome to the ARE Podcast. Where it's all about encouraging and inspiring you today so you can fulfill your dream of becoming a licensed architect tomorrow. And now your host, David Doucette.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the ARE Podcast, joined once again by our co-host, Eric Corey Freed. Eric, how are you?
I'm fine. Hi, everybody.
Today, we've got a great topic, a sort of simple one, I guess, but can have, not great consequences if we're confused on it. It's round up or round down. So you're in the exam and you do a calculation and you come up with 13.7. And the answers, two of the answers down there are 13 and another one is 14. Which one do you choose? And I think it's kind of, we're sort of taught maybe that just you round up. It just is sort of a general thing, but this is not certainly what we're talking about here. There's instances for either one for purposes of the exam, and that's what we need to know. And again, very simple, but you have to know them. Otherwise, I don't know if I choose 13 or if I choose 14. So, Eric, with that, what's the best way to approach this?
Well, the candidates always want, because they ask us all the time, just give me a hard, fast rule, right? They just want one rule to just take with them into the test. And I think what they want us to say is, well, when in doubt, round up.
Right, exactly.
But in truth, that doesn't work, especially when you get a question where, well, is it 13 or 14? And so a good example is if the requirements are for minimum parking, you have to provide a minimum of these many parking spaces, and you calculate 18.3 parking spaces. Well, you can't round down to 18 because then you haven't met the minimum, right? You have to in this case, round up to 19, and that's fine. And in part, it's a parking space, so erring on the side of caution makes sense. It makes logical sense in your brain, right? I got 18.3. There's no such thing as a 0.3 of a parking space unless it's for, a bike or something. So we'll round up to 19 and be done with it. But that's because the code specifically said it's for minimum number of parking spaces. What if the code says it's for a maximum number of parking spaces, and again, you calculate 18.3. Do you still round up to 19? No, because then you've now exceeded the maximum. If 18.3 is the max, doing 19 is too much. So now you round down. This confuses the heck out of everybody, but it makes sense if you start to put it into context. Another example, this came up on the coaching call this week, was floor area ratio, FAR. Somebody had calculated, 10.2 floors, and they rightfully thought, well, I can't have 0.2 of a floor, so I would guess I just round up to 11. But in doing that, you'd add too much square footage, right? So they'd have to round down to 10 or kind of reconfigure the footprint so that way you could still get 11 stories, but each footprint would be slightly smaller. Again, you got to think about the context here. FAR, floor area ratio, is a maximum number. Exit width, if you calculate the due to egress calcs that you need 37.6 inches, round it up to 38. Going bigger doesn't hurt anybody. It's an egress width, right? So that's where rounding up makes sense. But if you're looking at something, that is a maximum depth, and you calculate 18.2, well, going to 19 would be too much. So you have to be aware of the context. Is it minimum? Is it maximum? Does it potentially hurt someone to go bigger or go smaller? And then the last version of this is if your structural engineer calculates that you need 17.7 inches of beam depth. Well, going less means the beam wouldn't be strong enough. Going more means the beam's stronger but heavier. What do you do in that case? Well, again, you think about the context. Is the question hinting that weight is an issue? If so, then maybe you want to keep it just at exactly 17.7. If they're saying that you've got the plenum space and the strength to do it, then rounding up to 18 makes sense. So again, the context is the key, and it leaves you with kind of three key clues here. What is the intention behind the code or the provision or the requirement? Number two, why does the calc even exist? What are we calculating it for? Who's it protecting? And then number 3, what is the context? Where is it being used? Where would rounding up or rounding down cause a problem? Those 3 questions become kind of your key to finding out the best way to round up or round down.
Okay, my head hurts. I mean, that's a lot.
It's a lot.
But so there is no, after everything you just said, there is no sort of rule of thumb in that case. The answer that we're looking for, the really rounding up or rounding down, is going to depend literally on how the question is asked, and looking for sort of the minimum or maximum words, which may or may not be in that question.
Yeah, at the end of the day, these are judgment questions. They're not memorization questions. They're certainly not math questions. They're judgment questions. So if you know, a lot of candidates will do this. They'll do the math to, 4 decimal places because they're using a calculator, and they'll get really detailed with it. But architecture is not a game of, thousandths of an inch. We barely deal with quarter inch, eighth inch, and half inch, right? We're off by inches all the time. That's why shims exist, right? Because things are off. So we bring a level of precision to it, especially if you're a generation that grew up solely on CAD, right, where everything is super precise. So we bring this level of precision to it that doesn't really exist. And when we're doing the math, if you're getting beyond a tenth of an inch, you're already out of reality, right? So you only need to calculate 1 decimal point at most, unless the question asks for it otherwise. And then if it's a matter of rounding up or rounding down because the answers are only showing you whole numbers, well, then just think about the context. Don't just always assume that I need to round up, because it could backfire in the case of maximum parking requirements, FAR, right?
Well,
so think about it that way.
It seems to be, and obviously accounting, right? PCM, we have to be mindful of that. But it seems, I guess, in general, the topics that this would affect, I guess, most would be FAR, right? So we talked floor to area ratio. So we talked about that one. So just to talk about that one again, because that's one of the important ones. If, our FAR is 18.1, or let's say it's 18.9, well, why don't we just do that extra 0.1 and 19 and the client's happy? Well, we just exceeded the FAR because the 18.9 is the absolute max. We cannot go above that, right? And that's sort of the general strategy of the FAR is whatever number you're coming up with, you can't just round up for FAR because now you've just exceeded it. So then in parking, it's the same kind of logic, again, depending on how I ask the question here. If you come up with you need 19.1, you do your calculation. And if you round down to 19, because 0.1 is close to 19, but now you didn't meet the minimum. You need 19.1 spaces, which means you need 20. So it's also understanding the goal of what NCARB is trying to get across here. But as you said, Eric, too, the judgment of just an architect and what we do and the purpose of it, right? The purpose of the parking, the purpose of the FAR, and that should indicate to us, or at least help us, how we round up and round down. The other thing I wanted to mention is one that you didn't mention is we often see with plumbing fixtures, right? Then same thing. If we need 10.2 toilets, we can't round to 10 because we didn't meet the minimum of at least 10.2, which means 11.
Yeah, exactly right. And then, really kind of stepping back and saying, why does this code even exist, or this code provision even exist, is a good one. When it comes to accounting, like for practice management, well, that's always been a little weird, because if you think about it, when you do your taxes, you're rounding to the nearest dollar. Right? If you said that you've got $47.26 in business expenses, your accountant rounds that to 47 because it rounds down to the nearest whole number. So candidates get mad and like, what's the deal? In PCM, you told me to round to the nearest whole number, whether it's up or down. And now in PDD, you're telling me to round up or round down based on context. I'm confused. Again, it's all the same. It's all the same thing. You're being asked to provide a judgment, and your judgment's based on what's going on. Think about it this way. It's about standard of care. What would any other architect reasonably be expected to do given the same set of circumstances? That's what the questions are ultimately testing you on at the end of the day. And so whether you round up or round down is also dependent on that. I wish it was just easy enough to say always round up, but that can backfire.
Yeah, let's talk about the accounting principle, because I mean this is basic math, but architects just in general, aren't great at math anyway. But I think it does bear repeating, especially for PCM, when we're talking about round to the nearest whole dollar. So if it's $14.49, the nearest dollar is either 14 or it's 15. Now, 49 cents is closer to 14, so we're rounding down. If it's $14.51, the closest dollar is 15. So we're rounding up to 15. Again, very basic, but I think it's worth just sort of reminding everybody, especially for PCM, because that's just basic accounting math and rounding up, rounding down.
Especially if people are on a tear and they're rushing through the test and they're not recognizing that this question is really about accounting. Instead, that's a math question. And whether the question is asking about accounting or floor area ratio or parking requirements or exit width, they just see it as a math question. So they fall into this trap of just tell me like 8th grade calculus class, do I round up or round down? I just need a hard, fast rule. And that's part of the mindset shift that you need to overcome in order to pass the test anyway.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, actually, about all of this, because as I said at the beginning of the episode, the numbers and the concepts we're talking about are very simple. You could explain it to a second grader and they would understand it. But you mentioned the rushing in the exam, in the context of the exam. That's when we have a tendency to confuse this stuff. And that's the tendency when we get anxious and we're kind of all over the place. So that's the real purpose of sort of understanding the basics. So when we're under pressure, we can sort of just be like, oh, okay, I can recall. Simple math is really what we're doing, and very simple concepts. But I think, as we all know who've been through the ARE process, is sometimes simple stuff kind of goes out the window in the heat of the exam and the hot seat and all that stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. I have nothing more to add. This is
yeah, I think we've covered this one. Yeah. I think it is an important topic, and I'm glad we did it. The round up, round down. So the overall main concept is it depends. Do I round up? Do I round down? It depends. And just make sure you have the information to make the correct informed decision. So with all of that said, we actually finished one a little bit early. My name is David Doucette on behalf of Eric Corey Freed. We will see you guys on the next episode of the ARE podcast.
Thanks for listening to the ARE podcast. Be sure to visit architectexamprep.com and check out our other podcast episodes, video tips, and the ARE blog. Remember to plan, practice, and pass.